Hi there everyone, this is Lily coming to you with another tip of the week. And this week I'm bringing you a tip on harmony only, and this tip is on Deform basics. And the reason I'm doing this one is that there was definitely some feedback on the forums that that the Deform tool is really awesome and handy, and that people want to get started using it. But some of the video tutorials are really in-depth, and what they want is a quick start guide to how to just get up and running with Deform. So that's what I thought I'd bring you today. And I apologize if there's any background noise because today I'm recording from a hotel room in California. So let's start out now by just doing something with two very simple shapes. So I'm going to go into my timeline, and I'll keep my first drawing layer as it is, named drawing, and I'm just going to do a rectangle, nothing too exciting. Actually, I'll make the size a little bit smaller by holding down the O key. And there's my rectangle. Beautiful. Okay, and then I'm going to do another drawing with another rectangle over here. And the reason I'm doing two rectangles is that I want to show you the difference between using a curve style deformer and using a bone style deformer, which are the two styles of deformer that we have available in Harmony. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to color these in, and then if I want to really show off how this is working, then I'll load in a texture as well. So let me just go and see if I can find a texture that I can use here. I should have a paisley, there it is, that I like to use. And I'll just fill that in on each one of these boxes here so that I've got a texture that I can just show off how this is working. And now that I've got those filled and painted in, I can go ahead and get started with my Deform tool. So I'll use this box on the left here to show off the bone style deformer, and then I'll use the box on the right to show off the curve style deformer. So it's really easy to get started with this. All you need to do is make sure that you have your drawing layer selected, because it's going to automatically create a deformer on the drawing layer that you have. And then now you can select your rigging tool and then your setup mode. And let's explain this just a little bit really quickly. What happens is that when you're rigging something, like you're rigging a drawing, you want to have a mode or a state which is completely independent of your animation. And the reason that you need that is that sometimes you need to go back and adjust what the rig looks like. Like you might get partway through your animation and you're trying some stuff out, and then you realize that the rig that you have isn't going to cut it. So then what you do is you go into setup mode, which kind of resets it to its default state, and then you can make adjustments on your rig, and then you can leave setup mode and go back, and when you leave setup mode it's going to pop you back to your animation. So well, that will become clear a little bit further on, but for now, when we're getting started, if we're going to create a rig, we need to create it with our rig tool on, and then we click on setup mode just to go inside setup mode to make sure that we are working in that mode and that we're not in the animation mode. Now if I want to create a bone style deformer with my rig tool on and my layer selected, all I have to do is click. So I can just click once, which creates your first offset, and I click again, which creates the first bone, and then I click again and it creates an articulation in between the bones and my second bone. So that's all I have to do. I can right away, I can switch from my rigging tool to my transform tool. You'll notice when you switch to your transform tool that it turns off the rigging tool automatically. And then I also want to switch off of setup mode so I can see what's happening as I animate. And then I can move this around and we already see stuff happening here. So there's a couple of basic things that you need to know about when you're working with bones. And you'll notice as I start to twist this to extreme angles that you see that it becomes kind of tessellated there. And the reason that it does that is because it's using this articulation in the center to sort of slice up the drawing into pieces. And then where it slices that drawing into pieces, when you rotate it, you'll start to be able to see those pieces, like slice, slice, slice as you rotate. So, it's ideal when you're working with a bone style deformer if you can increase the size. That's the reason that we asked to increase the size of this articulation in the center. So let's go into setup mode, and then you notice, I'll just turn that off again. You'll notice if you have some animation on that part, when you click on setup mode, it just resets that animation, and then when you leave setup mode, now it's back into your animation state. So let's enter setup mode, and then we keep using our transform tool. We can use our transform tool to adjust the size of the articulation here. If I have my animate button on, it's going to create a keyframe there, so I'll just turn it off for setup mode, and then I can just drag on that articulation, and I'll make it about the size of my joint. And you see now, if you think about this the same way that I was just describing a moment ago with the other example or with the previous step, it's now making slices of the drawing all the way along this articulation. And then when I go, let's exit setup mode, you'll see how much smoother that is. And in fact, what I should do also is I'll go into setup mode, because you'll notice when I'm back out here, it has made this smaller. And the reason that this is smaller is that while I was animating, that's the size that it was before I left. So in fact, I probably want it to be something like this. And so you can either adjust it directly in here, but if you have many different keyframes, then what you would want to do is go into setup mode, and then you want to copy this position back to the animation mode. And that's what this option up the top is, copy resting position to current. And I just need to make sure that I select my deform group when I do so, or if you're working in your network, you can select your deform group over here. And then when you copy resting position to current, now that is my new sort of animation state. So as I leave setup mode, I can now animate from here. And you see how much nicer that is when you're doing animations. And then if we want to start talking about things like what happens when you overlap, that sort of thing, I want to leave that for a different tip of the week, because I'm trying to keep these tips of the week really sort of short, quick tips, and I think that's something that could be a separate module. But to finish up what we're talking about this week, I want to do another example now on the other drawing over here that's going to be a curve style deformer. So I'll select my other drawing. And remember, I have to go to my rigging tool, and then I have to enter setup mode. And now that I'm in that, I'm going to do something slightly different than what I did last time. Instead of doing a click, 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 I'm going to do a click and drag. But beware, don't click and drag along the whole length of your drawing, because when you're doing this click and drag, what it's doing is it's creating a Bezier handle on a curve. So if you drag it all the way across, then your Bezier handle will be way too long. So you just want to do a small drag. So let's start at the top, and I'll do a drag, maybe about to there, and you see how it creates my Bezier handle. And then I'll go to the end of the drawing, and I'll drag upwards, and you can see as I do it, it's showing me the handle, so I can position the handle how I want it to be. Now that I've got that done, I can exit setup mode, and then I can switch to my transform tool, and now I can move these points around to see this drawing, being animated, or how it's going to animate. And you see how beautifully this works on a drawing layer, especially when you are not dealing with zones of influence. And what I mean by that is that in this case, all I'm doing is I have one drawing, and I'm putting one deformer on it, or like a series of them all in a row or all in a line. It works really well because we have an infinite, what we call an infinite region of influence. And what that means is that when you look at your curve, or when you look at your bone, an infinite region of influence is just going to go parallel or perpendicular out infinitely in all directions and affect your drawing. And that works really